Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. The Union Cabinet has approved a proposal for setting up public Wi-Fi hotspots under a program known as PM Vani. It stands for Prime Minister's Public Wi-Fi Access Network Interface. This digital infrastructure initiative is expected to revolutionize Wi-Fi access and access to high-speed broadband internet services in the country. So let's understand the salient features and the objectives of this initiative in complete detail. See, the proposal to set up public Wi-Fi hotspots around the country was first made by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India back in 2017. And this proposal of TRAI was backed by the Department of Telecommunications as well. Now, the Union Cabinet has accepted this proposal, and under the PM Vani initiative, public Wi-Fi network hotspots will come up across the length and breadth of the country, and these services will be provided through entities known as Public Data Offices or PDOs, with the support of another entity known as Public Data Office Aggregators or PDOAs. So the establishment of such public Wi-Fi hotspots across the country will help in the penetration of high-speed broadband internet services, especially in the remote and unconnected areas and as well as in urban centers. Under the PM Vani initiative, the public data offices and the public data office aggregators need not pay any license fee to the government for providing broadband services through these public Wi-Fi hotspots. So this will encourage more individuals and entities to register as public data offices and public data office aggregators in order to provide high-speed broadband internet services through these public Wi-Fi hotspots. The proliferation of such broadband internet services through these public Wi-Fi hotspots will help in creating numerous employment and entrepreneurial opportunities, which will help in enhancing the income of the people, especially the small and marginalized sections, and it would lead to the overall empowerment of the society. To establish the public Wi-Fi hotspot ecosystem under PM Vani, 4 different entities are being created. One is the Public Data Office or PDO. Next we have Public Data Office Aggregator or PDOA. Then we will have an app provider and a central registry. The Public Data Office will basically establish, maintain and operate the public Wi-Fi access points and provide for broadband services to the subscribers. This Public Data Office would be similar to the public phone booths or PCOs or the cyber cafes that we used to have. And this Public Data Office could be any establishment such as a tea shop, a kirana shop in the road, and these entities can establish public Wi-Fi access points and maintain and operate them and provide for high-speed broadband services. At the next level, we would have the PDOAs or the Public Data Office Aggregators, who would aggregate all the PDOs and perform the functions relating to authorization and accounting. These aggregators would basically provide authorization to the PDOs to establish public Wi-Fi hotspots and provide services to the subscribers. The aggregators would also carry out the accounting with regard to data usage, subscriber base, etc. Another model which would help you understand this arrangement would be the Ola-Uber model. Ola and Uber, they are basically aggregators, and the drivers register with these aggregators and use their cars to provide the services. So similarly, the Public Data Office aggregators will perform the task of aggregation and they provide for authorization and accounting for the PDOs. The PDOs, which could be entities such as tea shops, kirana shops, etc., they could establish the public Wi-Fi hotspots and provide the broadband services. Next, there would also be an app provider who would develop an app to register the users and also to help identify the public Wi-Fi hotspots. Basically, for your phones, your laptops and smart devices to identify the public Wi-Fi hotspots, there would be a need for a separate application which also provides for registration of the users. If you have ever used public Wi-Fi hotspots at airports or at hotels, you would know how this actually functions. Basically, your phones and smart devices, they automatically recognize any open Wi-Fi networks, and once you try to access these hotspots, you would be taken to an application or a web page where you would be required to register yourself, and then you can start using these services for free. So in the backend, there would be an app provider who would develop such an application to register the users and help the devices recognize the availability of public Wi-Fi hotspots. Then finally, at the central level, there would be a central registry which would maintain the details of the app providers, the PDOAs and the PDOs. As per the proposal that has been approved, such a central registry would be maintained by the CDOT or the Center for Development of Telematics, which is a central government entity. Now let's understand the objectives of this initiative. See, according to TRAI, in most major economies, especially the Western economies, nearly 50 to 70% of the total internet usage time is done through mobile phones that are connected to Wi-Fi networks. And since Wi-Fi networks provide for more stable and high-speed connections, and since in these countries most mobile users are connected to high-speed internet on the go, it provides for a number of benefits to the overall economy. When people are able to access stable and high-speed internet connections on the go, it will enable them to access better quality services across education, banking, and all the other forms of internet-based transactions. So such public Wi-Fi infrastructure would be extremely beneficial to every stakeholder in the society. It would be very beneficial for businesses, for workers, small-time entrepreneurs, and even for students, vendors, and laborers. This number for India stands at just 10%. That is, hardly 10% of the total internet usage time in India is reported through mobile phones that are connected to high-speed Wi-Fi connections. So in order to accelerate the penetration and proliferation of high-speed public Wi-Fi internet, the government is looking to launch the PM Vani initiative with a very simplified process. Under this initiative, the public data offices who are establishing and providing the internet services, they need not register themselves. They need not acquire any license and they need not pay any fee to the government. And this acts as an incentive for the PDOs to take up the initiative to set up public Wi-Fi hotspots. They could either provide these services for free or they could even charge a nominal fee, which would basically help them to boost their revenues. Then the public data office aggregators and the app providers, they have to get registered with the DOT, that is the Department of Telecommunications, through a very simplified process by registering through an online portal of the DOT. And they need not pay any registration fee or license fee for this registration. Under the initiative, the government has guaranteed to authorize the registration within 7 days in order to make it easier for the app providers, for the PDOAs and the PDOs to actively take part under the PM Vani initiative. This would not only help in the delivery of stable and high-speed broadband internet, especially during the pandemic, but it would also help in enabling India's ease of doing business. The pandemic has really highlighted the need for high-speed internet, especially 4G services, because almost all basic essential services have already shifted to the online format, including education, medicine, and of course, even our work and entertainment. So by encouraging the spread of such public Wi-Fi hotspots, the government is looking to create more employment opportunities and give a boost to the economy, which in turn would enhance the income of the small and medium entrepreneurs. The objectives of the PM Vani initiative is completely in line with the ambitious Digital India program, and it would not only help in enhancing incomes and creating employment opportunities, but it would also improve the overall quality of life and create a business-friendly environment by improving the ease of doing business index in India. Next, in a related development, the Union Cabinet has approved the laying of undersea OFC cable or submarine OFC cable to connect 11 islands of the Lakshadweep with mainland India. Under this ambitious project, 11 islands of Lakshadweep, such as Kavaratti, Kalpeni, Agathi, etc., they would be connected with Kochi by 2023. The objective of laying this submarine cable is obviously to improve digital connectivity in the Lakshadweep Islands, similar to the project that was inaugurated recently by the Prime Minister in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. Recently in August 2020, the Prime Minister inaugurated a submarine OFC cable that connects the Andaman Nicobar Islands with mainland India. And during his Independence Day speech, the Prime Minister had committed to lay a similar undersea OFC cable to connect the Lakshadweep Islands within 1000 days. The laying of such submarine OFC cables will bring a number of benefits to the island territories of India by providing high-speed internet connectivity with higher bandwidth. The provision of such digital infrastructure will help improve the delivery of e-governance services such as DBT or direct benefit transfer, and it would also enable improved financial and banking services, and it would allow the government to directly transfer subsidies, pensions and PF amount to the account of the beneficiaries. The provision of such high-speed internet to the remote island territories through the laying of submarine cable will also be a major boost to the local economy, and it would be immensely beneficial to the core sectors of Lakshadweep such as fisheries, coconut, etc. It would also help transform services related industries such as tourism, education and as well as the provision of healthcare services. The funding for this ambitious connectivity project would be provided through the Universal Service Obligation Fund, which falls under the DOT or the Department of Telecommunications. This fund is primarily used by the government to fulfill its commitment of universal service obligation. Under the universal service obligation concept, the government has committed itself to provide for telecom and internet connectivity in remote, rural and unconnected areas. See, generally, private service providers are driven by the profit motive, and hence the lack of subscriber base in remote, rural and unconnected areas acts as a disincentive for the private service providers from creating telecom and internet infrastructure in these locations. The economics of these regions is simply not viable for private service providers to create the essential telecom and internet infrastructure. So under the universal service obligation concept, the government steps in and it imposes a levy, which is a type of a tax on the overall revenue of the private service providers. This also applies for public service providers as well, such as BSNL. So those companies that provide telecom and internet services, they are obligated to pay this levy, which is charged upon the overall revenue of these companies, and this levy is deposited in the Universal Service Obligation Fund. And these funds are used by the government to create the essential telecom and internet infrastructure in rural areas, remote areas, and other unconnected locations with complex terrains such as hilly areas, island territories, border regions, and even the Naxal corridor. Through the Universal Service Obligation Fund, the government steps in and creates the essential infrastructure in these rural, remote and unconnected areas, and it creates a base for the private players to step in and provide their improved services. This concept was first proposed under the new telecom policy of 1999, and it was later brought into effect in 2002. In 2003, the Indian Telegraph Act was amended to provide the fund with legal or statutory status. Now let's take up another article from page number 1. An archaeological study that was conducted by the University of Cambridge and the Banaras Hindu University has found evidence of cattle, buffalo, pig and mutton meat residue in the Indus Valley vessels that date back to at least 4,600 years. This study was conducted across several Indus Valley sites such as Rakigari, Farmana and Masudpur, most of which are located in present-day UP and Haryana. It is already a well-established fact that ceramic vessels and earthen pots were being used during the Indus Valley civilization. The fossils that have been found across several Indus Valley sites in India and as well as in Pakistan provides clear evidence for this. So archaeologists have always been interested in analyzing the residue samples present in these vessels and pots, because that would help in understanding the diet and the lifestyle and the larger socio-economic conditions of the Indus Valley civilization. In this study, the researchers have particularly focused on lipid residue that might have been left behind in these ceramic vessels and pots. Because see, lipids do not degrade so easily, and they have the ability to persist in the pores of these vessels for centuries together. Thanks to latest advances in archaeological sciences and molecular biology, these lipid residue samples can be extracted from the vessels because they would have been absorbed by the pores present in these vessels. By extracting the samples, that is the residue samples, they can be analyzed and studied, which helps in determining and estimating the diet and the lifestyle that was practiced by the Indus Valley civilization. The composition of food in turn helps us understand the socio-economic conditions and as well as several cultural traits of the Indus Valley civilization. So this study, which has found meat residue belonging to cattle, buffalo, pig and mutton, accompanied with a large-scale discovery of bone fragments of cattle and other animals across Indus Valley sites, clearly shows that the Indus Valley civilization was predominantly a meat-consuming society. The study also indicates that the people of the Indus Valley civilization were not only consuming the meat of sheep and goat, but they were also consuming the so-called forbidden meats, which includes pork, beef, etc. So these findings have a lot of socio-cultural relevance even for today. But however, in this study, very little evidence has been found about the usage of dairy products. But if you recollect, recently we had covered one more article wherein archaeologists who were part of a different study had found conclusive evidence of large-scale use of dairy products while analyzing the pottery and vessel fossils that were discovered across several Indus Valley sites in Gujarat. So this also points to regional differences in the diet that was practiced during the Indus Valley civilization. Probably in the Gujarat region, the consumption of dairy products was higher as compared to meat consumption, indicating a largely vegetarian diet. Whereas in Indus Valley sites spread across today's Haryana, UP and even Pakistan, analysis of vessel fossils have provided evidence of meat residue, indicating a largely non-vegetarian diet. But most studies that are emerging in this area, they are indicating that the Indus Valley civilization was predominantly a meat-consuming society. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, which evaluates the challenge of malnutrition in India. See, this column has been written by the Chief of Nutrition for UNICEF India. He says that India, which is a country of billion-plus people, has laid down ambitious goals for itself in order to emerge as the next leading economic powerhouse of the world. But however, according to the writer, the single biggest threat that could prevent India from achieving this dream is malnutrition. Because chronic and widespread malnutrition in the country has a disastrous impact on the people, especially on the children. The lack of access to nutritious food and even micronutrients, especially at a young age, can affect both physical development and as well as mental development of an individual. This in turn leads to a variety of deficiencies, illnesses and diseases, and it could even result in increased child mortality, especially those children under the age of 5 years. And those who manage to survive, they might end up suffering from stunting and wasting. Stunting is a condition that arises out of malnutrition, wherein a child fails to attain his potential height. Then wasting is also a condition that arises out of malnutrition, wherein a child is too thin for his height. And these conditions that arise out of malnutrition can directly affect the physical development and as well as the mental development of the child. And in India, the problem of child malnutrition is extremely severe because according to a report from 2017, out of nearly 1 million deaths of children, those who were under the age of 5 years, nearly 68% of them had died because of malnutrition. Honestly, this is not just an alarming number for India, but it is also a very shameful number for India. Because if a country fails to feed its own people, especially children, then it may never be able to realize its dream of establishing itself as an economic powerhouse. Because malnutrition is a condition which can cause a generational setback to the entire country. Because when children do not receive the right kind of nutrition, especially in the initial few years, it directly affects their brain development and the development of cognitive skills. This in turn affects their learning capabilities in school, and the overall physical and mental weakness also affects their productivity even as adults. This causes more and more illness and deficiencies amongst the population, and it creates a vicious cycle wherein malnutrition directly contributes to poverty. And further, those who are poor, they won't be able to access nutritious food and quality healthcare services, which further affects their health and further pushes them into poverty. So this vicious cycle can be broken only with large-scale intervention by the government. But over the years, India has indeed made considerable progress with regard to providing essential nutrition to its population. In fact, India runs one of the world's largest childhood public intervention schemes, such as the Integrated Child Development Scheme, the Midday Meal Program in government schools, and public distribution system through which food security and nutritional security is guaranteed through the National Food Security Act. Then recently in 2018, with the initiative of the Indian Prime Minister, India has launched the ambitious Poshan Abhiyan, which seeks to fulfill all the nutritional requirements of the population. So while India was making considerable progress in tackling malnutrition, its efforts have been completely derailed and disrupted by the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns have had a disproportionate impact on the weaker sections, and it has aggravated the problems of food insecurity. The economic disruption and the disruption caused to essential services by the pandemic has directly affected the administration and delivery of several government schemes such as ICDS, midday meal programs and PDS, which were essentially implemented through Anganwadi centers, schools, hospitals and the PDS network of ration shops. The functioning of all these centers, which are critical for service delivery with regard to these government programs, has been completely disrupted by the pandemic and the lockdown. Then moreover, the pandemic-induced economic difficulties is leading to several long-term socio-economic changes, which might lead to an increase in child marriage, early motherhood, discontinuation of schooling, reduced institutional deliveries, and thereby reduced access to nutritious food and micronutrients. So the pandemic has disrupted India's progress and efforts towards tackling malnutrition, and this could very well become a generational setback for India that could prevent the country from achieving its ambitious dreams. Hence, the writer remarks that malnutrition is the single biggest threat for India's dreams and ambitions, and hence this challenge has to be tackled at the foundational level. While the country has made good progress under Poshan Abhiyan with the leadership of the Prime Minister, the country is currently in need of similar leadership skills at the level of the state and the district, especially considering the disruption that the pandemic has caused to nutrition-related schemes. So if the objectives of Poshan Abhiyan have to be fully achieved, then it requires national level leadership by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, accompanied with state level leadership displayed by the state chief ministers along with the state cabinets. And finally at the grassroots, we would need district level leadership displayed by the district magistrate, accompanied with proactive involvement of the local panchayats. Along with decisive leadership, what we need is the allocation of adequate financial resources, and it should be primarily targeted towards vulnerable communities such as women, children, urban slums, migrant workers, tribal areas, with a special focus on those districts which report very high levels of malnutrition. But this is an effort that cannot be led by the government alone. This would require a multi-stakeholder approach with the active involvement of the private sector, the civil society, the academia, with the involvement of global development partners such as the United Nations, the World Bank, etc. Then to track India's progress towards achieving nutritional security, the central government will have to put in place an effective monitoring and feedback mechanism through which all the relevant data related to critical nutritional indicators can be collected, and this has to be systematically analyzed in order to carry out a desired course correction. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following are the environmental risks associated with landfills? Leaching of toxins and pollutants into the groundwater table, emission of greenhouse gases, rise in disease spreading vectors, breakout of fires that cause air pollution. All the four are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 2 that makes a reference to fires that are triggered at urban landfills. Landfills are places where all the urban waste that is generated is dumped into the ground, and these landfills represent a major environmental risk. At these landfills, toxic pollutants can leach and enter the groundwater table and also pollute the soil. They are also responsible for the release of greenhouse gases such as methane due to partial decomposition. These landfills could also promote an exponential increase in the population of disease-spreading vectors such as rats, flies, mosquitoes, etc. And the landfills can even catch fire because of the hazardous substances present and lead to significant air pollution. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following can induce nutritional stress on threatened herbivores in wildlife ecosystems? Clearing of vegetation for agriculture and industrial activities, overgrazing of nutritional grass by cattle, destruction of plant vegetation by floods and other natural calamities. All the three are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 4, overgrazing by cattle and the frequent flooding of the Brahmaputra river has destroyed the availability of nutritious food for rhinoceros, that is the great Indian one-horned rhinoceros, in the Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary of Assam, which is also referred to as the mini Kaziranga. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Indian bison or gaur is native to South Asia and Africa. It has been listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect because the Indian bison is native to South Asia and Southeast Asia, not Africa. So the correct answer is option B, 2 only. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 5 that makes a reference to the Indian bison, which has died after straying into a residential area near Pune. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The 104th Constitutional Amendment Act granted constitutional status to the National Commission for Backward Classes. Article 338B deals with the newly established National Commission for Backward Classes. Article 342A empowers the President to specify the socially and educationally backward communities in the state. Article 342A also says that it is for the Parliament to include a community in the central list for socially and backward classes for the grant of reservation benefits. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect because it is the 102nd Constitutional Amendment which granted constitutional status to the National Commission for Backward Classes, and it also introduced two new articles, that is Article 338B and Article 342A. So the correct answer is option C, 2, 3 and 4 only. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 9, a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court is examining the constitutional validity of the Maratha quota, which provides for reservation in education and jobs for the Maratha community through a law passed by the Maharashtra legislature. In this case, the Supreme Court is examining whether the state legislature has the powers to specify a particular community as socially and educationally backward. Because the 102nd Amendment Act, which was introduced in 2018, it inserted two articles, that is Article 338B and 342A. Article 338B dealt with the constitutional status of the National Commission for Backward Classes, and under Article 342A, it was the President of India who was empowered to specify socially educationally backward communities in a state. The same article also states that it is for the Parliament to include a community in the central list for socially and backward classes for the grant of reservation benefits. So this Maratha quota law passed by the Maharashtra legislature seems to contradict these constitutional provisions, and hence the Supreme Court is examining its constitutional validity. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Investigation Agency has the powers to file a charge sheet against foreign-based terrorists. Under the UAPA, that is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967, the government can order the attachment of properties and assets owned by foreign-based terrorists in India. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 9, the NIA has filed a charge sheet against 16 foreign-based Khalistan terrorists, and based on the advice of the NIA, the Ministry of Home Affairs has attached the property of these individuals in India as per the provisions of Section 51A of the UAPA. Now let's look at a question from the 2017 prelims paper. The painting of Bodhisattva Padmapani is one of the most famous and oft illustrated paintings at Ajanta. Option A is the right answer. Finally, let's look at a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, PM Vani has the potential to transform digital connectivity in the country. Discuss. The second question, the single greatest threat that blocks the promise of India at a foundational level is malnutrition. Examine the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.